Hi, welcome back to our series of videos, and today we're going to be talking about online polling in the classroom, which is something that you can do in face-to-face classrooms, but certainly online as well. I'll talk about some of the best practices involved and then recommend 3 free tools for those of you who are interested in doing more polling in your classes. One of the reasons for this video is that, as many of you know, while Zoom does have a polling function, Google Meet does not, unfortunately, for the time being. Of course, you're always free to use Zoom in your courses if you like, but IT does recommend using Google Meet because it's more secure within our IT infrastructure. So if you are using Google Meet but would like to add some polling functionality to your courses, we'll talk about some of those options a bit later in this video. Just to get things started, I'll make sure everybody understands what we're talking about. Polling, quite simply, is asking students questions but with some kind of electronic app or program. There are a number of benefits to doing this as opposed to simply asking questions and waiting for a verbal response. Though that system is also good for other kinds of results, it's really about finding the right tool for what you want to accomplish. One of the benefits of polling with an app is that just in general, as compared to simply lecturing, polling can be a way to engage students. It can be a way to wake them up if they have become sort of passive listening to lectures. And obviously this has more to do with traditional face-to-face classes than our current situation, but it's worth noting anyway that polling is a good way to change up the state of mind that people are in. One of the differences with polling is that it usually involves a visual element as opposed to just asking a verbal question. And it doesn't involve slides. It can involve more sort of graphical interfaces, as I'll show you in a few moments. So that also can help to get students sort of re-engaged in the classroom environment. So it's simply a good tool to use for that. One of the benefits, though, as compared to asking questions verbally, well, there are a couple, is that when you do polling, you collect data about the entire student body present as opposed to just one individual. Typically, if we ask a question, we get one response, or maybe if that first response is wrong, we might ask for another one. But typically, when we ask verbal questions in a class, we get one individual's response. And a lot of the time, that's really a tool for us to be able to proceed to the next question. It's not actually a very good check on how the class is, or everybody who's attending the class is doing with respect to whatever content we're trying to cover or investigate. When you do polling, it's an opportunity to get everybody's response and then show it graphically. And so that is a much more effective way to get a sense of where the class is about an opinion or knowledge or whatever it is. So that's one benefit over asking verbal questions. Another one that we often underestimate as instructors, but that does matter very seriously to lots of students, is that it's a way for them to respond to questions or give feedback to you on a topic that is usually anonymous, at least as far as everybody else in the class goes. Most of us have forgotten this by now, but research consistently shows that when it comes to undergraduate students, especially in lower level years, there continues to be, as there always has been, a fear of simply looking dumb in front of the rest of the class if they propose the wrong answer or are seen to be trying to maybe suck up to the professor. People have all kinds of weird quirks about answering questions in a large environment. We're usually at ease in that environment because we're the expert. They're not. They're taking a shot in the dark a lot of the time, even if they're prepared for class, because they don't know what the right answer is when they answer questions. And so a lot of the time, when we ask questions, we don't get a lot of response, and that's one of the reasons why. The fact is that asking verbal questions and asking students to respond verbally doesn't actually privilege people who are prepared. It privileges people of a certain personality type. It privileges those people who are willing to take a shot at talking in a large room full of people, whether or not they're prepared. And we've all had those experiences with students who consistently put up their hand, whether or not they're prepared. So that's the downside of asking verbal questions. You're really just privileging the people who are, whether you want to call it extroverted or whatever you want to call it, willing to speak up in that environment. And we all know, or we should know, that there are lots of students who have a good idea of the answer but are just too nervous to speak up. And so that's one of the things that polling mitigates, because it's a chance for students to give feedback or respond to the question in an anonymous fashion. Now, in some of the systems I'm going to talk about, you are able to see who has responded what if you want to, but that's okay. Students aren't worried about you knowing. They're worried about looking foolish in front of a group. And so when you remove that barrier, you tend to get much more response to questions in a classroom environment, be that online or face-to-face. So those are some of the reasons to do polling. As far as some of the better ways to do polling, I'll just touch briefly on these. If you're thinking about doing polling during a synchronous session, that is while all of you are meeting in a live Google Meet, what you want are questions that are short relatively, and they don't, I guess, necessarily have to be simple, but they do have to be direct. You don't want them to be too convoluted, but you want them to be challenging or thought-provoking. So these kinds of questions are not necessarily sort of very nuanced or detailed content-related questions. If you want people to get involved, you want to give them something to think about, something to ponder, something that makes them curious or wonder. Because at this point, if we're doing synchronous questioning, a lot of the time what we do want is to get some kind of discussion going. We want to prompt more interaction. And so the best way to do that is with a direct and thought-provoking question, rather than something that is specifically or strictly content-related. It might be an application question or a comparison question, something like that, something that really gets people talking, as opposed to just trying to think about details from the content. Now, when you're doing asynchronous kind of delivery, you can do more complex questions, and you can still do a kind of polling with this. One of the tools that I'm going to talk about in the Google Suite lets you do asynchronous polling, where students can supply their answers on their own time, but it all gets recorded. So it's a different kind of polling, but it gives students the chance to either think about their answers, or maybe if they have to do some research in order to answer the question, you still get the class-wide results of the polling. It just happens in a different time frame. So that's two different ways to think about polling in synchronous and asynchronous environments. Really, the thing to think about when it comes to polling, as with basically any other instructional activity or tool, is this related or important to your pedagogical goals for the course? This is reflected most appropriately in your learning outcomes, if and when learning outcomes are done properly. So the question of whether or not you should be doing polling, I've given you some reasons to consider doing it, but ultimately, it depends on what it is you're trying to achieve with these students in this class. In some classes, engaging in that way is going to be more important, and in some classes it'll be less important, and that's okay. As long as you've figured out what your learning goals or learning outcomes are for the course and you're following those, then the different elements will fit together and make sense to you and your students. So that's a bit of a primer on polling. I'm going to move on now to talking about polling tools. The tools that I'm going to talk about here, there are 3 of them, are all free. They have paid options, but I'm only going to be focusing on the free versions and what you get with those. I'm going to try to point out the strengths and weaknesses of each, because they're all sort of slightly better for different kinds of scenarios. And I'm going to be focusing on generally what they're useful for and generally how to use them. This isn't going to be a detailed walkthrough of how to use these tools. Most of them have instructions online. If you try to use a tool and you get stuck, you can always email me, and if lots of people request walkthrough videos, I can do those. But certainly check them out, because most of them are fairly intuitive to learn how to use. So the first one I'll talk about is called Socrative. This is a free app that is web-based and app-based. One of the benefits of it is that it is intuitive for designing polling and then for students to do the polling. And it's also very sleek, which makes it a little bit fun for most people. This is just a quick screenshot of what sort of the home page would look like once you're in the instructor section and ready to design the activity that you want. So they have this quiz option, which is what most of you will use to design quizzes in advance. They don't have to have a grading component, even though it's called a quiz, so it can be used for polling. You can also do one-off questions, multiple choice and true false. And then as you see this thing called Space Race here, this app is designed for high school and university use. So As I said, it's a little bit graphical, it's a little bit fun, and for some of you that might not be appropriate, but some of you might want to take advantage of that, because one of the benefits of Socrative is that it does include a kind of a gamification element. And that's one of the other benefits of polling, is that when you're using an app, most apps now have a little bit of a gamification element where there's like a timer that you can use, or, teams or individuals can get badges for responding quickly. And it's important not to underestimate the engagement and motivation factor in little things like that. People in courses, students, or grown-ups always respond to gamification. Maybe not always, but most of the time consistently, regardless of age. Gamification does tend to make things like questions and answers less daunting and simply more fun. And so we do tend to get more response when there's some element of gamification introduced. And Socrative does a good job of doing that for you. You also can choose a few different question styles: multiple choice, true, false, short answer, as you saw on there. So that's flexible to a degree as well. Socrative is really good for spontaneous or quick synchronous polling. So if you get comfortable with it, it's fairly easy to set something up quickly in Socrative and then send it out to your students, or give your students access to the question. You can also prepare it in advance. Once you get comfortable with it, it really is a quick setup, which is one of the nice things about this particular app. Now, because this is the free version of Socrative, it does have some limitations, as does one of the other tools I'll talk about. And the limitation with Socrative is that you can only do one activity with up to 50 participants at a time. So the one activity means it's not that easy to switch between quizzes, for example. You sort of have to put all of your questions in one quiz, and then you can time when you release them to the students. You don't have to do it all at once. And there's a maximum of 50 participants, which will work for most people at Concordia, though not necessarily everybody. But that is a standard limitation on free versions. So that's Socrative. It's sort of the most fun and sleek of the tools that I'm going to talk about. Google Forms is sort of the opposite. It's definitely the most powerful of the three tools I'm talking about, and it is very flexible, but it does have a slightly steeper learning curve, and it isn't as necessarily as fun or slick looking as Socrative. Now, you can do lots with your Google Forms to make them look slick and fun, but it's not built into the system. It's a different kind of process. So to give you an idea of what Google Forms looks like a little bit and how it works, this is the Google Forms homepage. The way that you get here is this little menu, this 3x3 menu, appears in this spot in all of your Google Suite apps. So if you're in your Gmail, your Concordia Gmail, or your calendar, you'll see this here. You simply click that. These are all of the different Google apps that we have access to. And if you scroll down, you click that, and that's how you get here to Forms. So what you see here is they have suggestions for formats that you might like. There is a template gallery as well, which if you click on General, you can scroll through different styles that you may want to use. And so these are some pre-formatted kinds of polls that you may use, but you can also create one from scratch. This is just a quick look at the assessment format that they have pre-suggested. It's got a title, and then it's got just text that you can delete and replace with your own. This is where you can see some of the different kinds of questions: multiple choice, another multiple choice, short answer, and then there are lots of different kinds of possibilities here. And so this menu on the side is what you would use to create and navigate your quizzes and questions. Again, quizzes typically being, in this case, not graded. And then when you do have responses, once it's sent out to students, you'll click on this, and then in this space you will see the responses represented different ways. You can see it graphically with different kinds of tables or charts. You can see individual questions and answers grouped by question and answer, or grouped by student or responder through email. So that it really is quite powerful, and there's a lot that you can do here if you are interested in taking that step forward. One of the nice things about Google Forms is that because it's built into, as you saw, our IT infrastructure, there's no limit on numbers. We have access to the full services of this app. So the limits that exist on numbers in the other two tools don't exist in Google Forms, which will be important to some of you with large classes. It is also the most secure. The other apps are quite secure. There's no reason to expect anything bad to happen with them. But in our case, all of the or in the case of Google Forms, I should say, all of the data is contained within Concordia's Google Suite and are quite safe that way. You do need for Google Forms to send the forms or emails about the forms out to students through email. There are a few other ways as well, but this is different from the other tools. The other two that I'm talking about, what you will do is create your questions, and then you'll either give students something like a URL to visit or a login code or something like that. So that takes a little bit less work at the start than Google Forms, which is going to involve getting all of your students' emails and pasting them in and sending it out. Now, if you're comfortable with that, great. It's not a hard thing to do, certainly, but that is one of the slight downsides to Google Forms. Finally, the other advantage to Google Forms is that everything that happens in and through Google Forms is saved in your Concordia Google Drive, so you can access it forever as long as you're at Concordia in any format that you want, and edit it, reuse it, things like that. So that is a benefit as well to Google Forms. The last tool I want to talk about is something a lot of you have already talked to me about. It's called Poll Everywhere. It's kind of a middle of the road tool compared to the two that I just spoke about. It's a little bit sleeker and simpler than Forms. I'd say definitely sleeker, a little bit simpler than Google Forms. And it's more flexible, but sort of less intuitive and less gamified than Socrative. So it's kind of a balance. Some people find that the flexibility it allows is beneficial over something like Socrative. Some people find it to be more than they need. So you can think of it as that middle of the road for when you check it out. This is really more a matter of personal taste and style for the most part than of quality. It really is up to you which one you think will work best for your course and your students. This screenshot again gives you an idea. You can see there are more question types than in Socrative, but the whole thing is a little bit prefabricated for you, so you can create things using the Poll Everywhere design tools. They will all look a certain way, and it's a little bit sleeker than what you get in Google Forms, at least as far as what you don't have to design on your own. Poll Everywhere does not have an app, which is different from Socrative, and some people may like this and some may not. Students either go to a website that is given to you when you create a new set of questions, or they can actually use their phones to text in their answers, and the results all get processed the same way. So those are options that some students might like. That's how Poll Everywhere works. Like Socrative, there is a limit on the number of people who can be involved in a single poll. Here it's 40, so again, for some of you that won't work. So that's the overview. Hopefully it's been a little bit helpful in terms of thinking about polling and whether or not you want to do it and how. If you do try them out and get stuck and need more information about this, or obviously anything else that I've talked about in these videos, please feel free to reach out anytime, and I hope your term is going well. Thanks for listening.